Thank you first and foremost for joining us in an air-conditioned room on one of the most beautiful days in February that you'll have in New York. So hopefully we'll entertain you and keep you excited as we go, and then you can run outside and play in the fountain or whatever you need to do. My name is Jason Schultz. I'm a clinical professor here. I teach the Technology Law and Policy Clinic for the second and third year law students. I also am a faculty director of the Engelberg Center on Innovation Law and Policy. And I work with a new research institute here at NYU called the AI Now Institute, which looks at the social and economic implications of artificial intelligence. And I'm excited because we have an amazing panel of conversationalists, I'll say. We're not going to be speaking so much as hopefully talking to each other about this topic, which is artificial intelligence and accountability. And the reason I'm excited, there are many reasons I'm excited about this topic and glad that you're all here. One is that the question of government accountability and public agency accountability, I think, is on many people's minds now more than ever for a lot of reasons. But one of which is that the ways in which government works, I think we've made a lot of assumptions for a very long time about how they are responsive to the kinds of questions we have as people living in a city or a state or a country in terms of how we're treated. Are we treated fairly? Do we have an idea of how government works? Do we trust how government works? Do we have a way of verifying that government even does work and how it works? And how do we improve how it works? How do we make it better? How do we know and measure whether we're being successful at running a good government system? And as technology has advanced, these questions have become not just questions of policy or politics or sociology, but also of technology. And as government looks to use more and more technology to help make important decisions, and decisions that impact everything from the criminal justice system as to who is in jail and who is not, to questions of housing, education, the environment, everything that they do for us and on our behalf, we have to also think about, well, how are these technologies part of the way that government is held accountable? How is government responsive when it relies more and more on technologies? And so, as some of you may know, here in our own city, the New York City Council passed a bill recently that requires Mayor de Blasio to appoint a task force to look at some questions that have been raised about what are called, in the bill, automated decision systems. And these are systems which are not defined in the bill, of course, but if one looks at them and sort of looks at what the conversation is, are this idea that there are decisions being made, as I mentioned, about all of our lives, and sometimes we are looking to the technology to actually either strongly suggest the answer, or even to make the answer itself a determination of the system, right? So the computer and the algorithm and all the data will be then spitting out an answer that will be, unless we do some intervention, implemented in some way. So an example of this, for instance, is high school assignments in New York City, and as we'll hopefully talk about, this is an area where computerized matching or other kinds of decisions get made and might allocate which high school a student goes to, and then the question is, well, how much of that is automated, and how much of that is human, and how do those two factors integrate together? So in order to engage in this conversation broadly, but maybe even specifically within certain areas, I have three amazing conversation partners here. And so I'll start kind of from the end maybe and just quickly work back. I'm not big on introductions, so I'll just make it brief, and then we're going to talk a bit more about maybe how this integrates into our work. But on the end, we have Rachel Goodman from the ACLU. In the middle, we have Justice Mariano Florentino Cuellar from the California Supreme Court. And next to me, we have Rashida Richardson from the New York Civil Liberties Union. And so I'm going to open it up with a question of sort of why are we here, in the sense of you all do very different types of work if we just look at your job titles and the kind of organizations you might work for. But why are these topics around accountability and technology, and specifically automation and artificial intelligence, interesting to you, and how do you think about them as part of your work? And I'll just open it up to jump in, whoever wants to go first.
I was introduced first, so I'll take the fall. So I'm a litigator with the ACLU's Racial Justice Program. That means my job is to bring litigation that vindicates the civil rights of people of color in the United States. And my focus within that is on economic justice in particular. So I do a lot of work around fair housing and fair lending, and a little bit of kind of employment-related work as well, kind of broadly thinking about what are the strategies we can use to reduce the racial wealth gap that is, largely based on race and color in profound ways in the United States. And about 5 years ago, and I should back up kind of my personal story here is that I graduated from NYU Law School, where some of you may go to law school, in 2010, and I became a staff attorney at the ACLU after clerking shortly thereafter. And one of the things I really love about my job is that I have a certain amount of autonomy and flexibility within what I just described, which is a very broad mandate to think about those strategies. And these questions about software-based decision-making began to really crop up, although people weren't really looking at them as in this category, around the foreclosure boom and bust cycle in that area, right? We know there was a tremendous amount of online targeting of ads and lead generation that really enticed a lot of people who otherwise were not in the market for subprime loans to take out those loans, and had tremendous consequences for exacerbating the racial wealth gap when the foreclosure crisis happened. And so we did a bunch of work around the fallout from that crisis, started thinking about these questions a little bit, and sort of at the same time, down in DC, folks within the ACLU, in conversation with others in the civil rights community, were starting to deal with this issue that the civil rights community wasn't paying a lot of attention to tech, and the tech policy community wasn't paying a lot of attention to civil rights. And that is something that over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, we have sort of taken some steps to help remedy, and I think we're still very much working on that project with partners at AI Now and other civil rights organizations. There's been this gap. And I think, just to start things off, like a lot of lawyers are just afraid of the basic vocabulary of this set of issues. I am not a technologist, with the exception of knowing how to make things bolded in HTML. I don't think I could code anything. But these are the same set of questions that we answer in civil rights laws and in civil rights broadly, and all you kind of need to do, I think, is to become comfortable and unafraid of the basic vocabulary of adding the technology-related questions into these issues that we've already addressed. And so I would say that's where I am.
So first of all, let me say thank you for the invitation to be here. It's really great, and thank you to you for being in the room.
That.
Because you can say it if you want. I should say that if I were a student and the weather were this good, I might be outside right now. So thank you for being indoors.
Quick, lock the doors.
Okay. Lin-Manuel Miranda called this the greatest city in the world, and as a Californian, I have my questions about that. But if the weather is this good, I'm willing to accept. So look, I think that probably all of us are interested in what we're interested in some ways, because, if we're honest, because of our bio in some ways. And it's a little quirky, but let me just highlight 2 things that are true about my background. The first is I spent much of my childhood living along the US-Mexico border, first on the Mexican side, then the American side. And second, in part because of where I was born, which is right across the border in Mexico. I am an immigrant to the US, and I had to make the decision to become an American as an adult. This is certainly an interesting time to be an immigrant in the country. But the thing that happens, and for those of you who were born abroad maybe and either were thinking of becoming a US citizen or have done it, you know that you have to go through a process where you have to sort of assert how seriously you take all these things that otherwise you grow up just having in the background of your mind about the Constitution, about the rule of law, about the point of the separation of powers. Having done that as a first-year law student, no less, it sort of resonated with special power in my mind. And it is probably not a shock that having gotten interested a little bit in regulation and law enforcement growing up on the border, and then having had the experience of becoming an immigrant and having to talk about what the Constitution meant to me, it was a short hop from there to the most interesting subject in law, which is administrative law, of course. How many of you have taken administrative law? Okay, so one of the reasons I love to teach administrative law is because the expectations are low when you begin. But as people go, they realize that this is a subject about something no less fundamental than how do you take science, democracy, and adjudicatory fairness and reconcile them. And somewhere along the line, the last few years, it became very clear to me as a law professor, as a university administrator, as a White House official, and now as a judge, that those questions run heavily through the relationship we have to computers increasingly. And we can talk and should talk a little about what artificial intelligence exactly means, but I'm going to be very low tech for a moment. What I mean simply is computers simulating human decision making in some meaningful way. And so I challenge you these days to think about any meaningful decision whatsoever, a military decision, a major decision in how to allocate resources in a big law enforcement agency, a question at the EPA about how to regulate a particular molecule that doesn't involve that relationship between human decision makers and organizations and computers. The last thing I'll say is that the other thing that was really salient to me about growing up on the border is that absolutely nothing works exactly the way it's planned. You can have laws that are supposed to work a certain way or ideas that are supposed to play out about how societies are integrated or separated, or how you patrol checkpoints, or how you ferret out contraband currency going from north to south, or guns going from north to south, and drugs coming from south to north. But it just simply does not always, and frankly always, does not work exactly the way it's planned. So that got me interested in criminal justice, in public health law, in immigration, and environmental policy. And I'd say just in all of those domains, you develop a sense of humility about overly optimistic or grand claims about how any particular technology or organization is going to solve all problems. And instead, you kind of end up with sometimes cautious optimism about how a new technology or organizational model can help change the world for the better, but only if you're really careful about what the implications are going to be.
Hi, so it may not, I don't think it says it in the form outside, but my title is Legislative Counsel, and I work in the New York State affiliate of the ACLU, so that means I work on state and local issues with our lovely legislators. And I'll get back to that in a second. And in general, I think I'll start off with why I like policy work. It allows me to use different skills, have to communicate persuasively to a lot of different audiences, and deal with a lot of different people and difficult personalities. And I think I have a knack for that. And what brings me to this issue is I think one of the challenges of doing policy work is you're dealing with governments, or just you're trying to figure out huge issues we haven't figured out, like housing instability, poverty, racism. These are the questions that governments are trying to grapple with real world constraints of we only have a budget this big, we only have staff this big, or we have all of these bureaucratic barriers, we're trying to address this within these confines. So it forces someone like me to have to think through the issue and sort of thread the needle of, okay, these are the constraints that this person is dealing with, these are the issues that need to be addressed, and you're sort of a missing high five a lot of the time, so what allows those hands to get closer together? And I think with AI, it's an interesting area because you see that it's sort of the confluence of technology trying to address some of those administrative constraints that government has to deal with. And there's this readiness to just jump to a quick, easy solution without grappling with, wait, maybe I should take a step back and question whether this is actually going to help affect the change that I'm trying to address, or if it's actually dealing with all the right inputs and questions that I traditionally have to do as someone working in direct services. And it really just allows me, as the person that has to explain these issues and push back on legislators, of what's the right balance. And I think it's interesting because there's not always a right answer, and it's also still trying to work towards addressing those broader systemic issues that we still don't really know the answers to. So how do you juggle all of those balls and not drop them? and allow for the machine, which is our government, to keep moving in a way that no one sort of slips through the cracks. So that was a sort of roundabout way of why I am interested in this, and I'll stop there.
Great. So there are a lot of different directions that this conversation can go, but as you mentioned, that it might. There was a question about what is our current understanding of the technologies that we're trying to figure out here. What does it mean to have computers involved, and what types of computers? And so, this label AI, this label artificial intelligence, is some percentage hype, right? Some percentage an amalgamation of various different pieces, and some percentage of like the same old thing all over again, right? That some computer system that has just been re-engineered in some new way to be the same thing it was before with a new label on it, right? But one of the sort of few categories of technological advancements, though, that I do think are real and that are playing into this that might affect how we think about this are sensor networks. So we all have devices that we interact with. Some of us may not own any of them, but we interact with them all the time. So, phones, the Link NYC little kiosks on the street, anytime you pay with a credit card or something, unless you're all cash all the time and you're totally off the grid. But we have smart meters now. We have all these different sensors and cameras and everything. So the number of different inputs that collect data on us and everyone in New York City has just gone up exponentially. So the kind of input and sensor network resources that can inform a computer system are far more sophisticated and diverse and robust. The other thing that I think most of us are aware of is the computational power of these systems, especially when they're linked together in the cloud or other places. It's just also gone off the scales that it used to be on, right? The ability to compute mathematical calculations and have algorithms, take into account, big data and massive amounts of data is at a different stage than it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago, and that's influencing what we think is possible in the space of, computers that might make decisions like humans, right? Another thing is just the algorithms themselves, right? And so we've seen a huge surge in the investment, both in academia and in the technology field, I think, in trying to make the mathematics and the kind of computations or the ways in which computers think more sophisticated, more advanced. And so if any of you have been reading about any of the things that talk about neural nets or other kinds of new ways of computing or coming up with determinations, right? They're huge leaps forward in that have to do with various sort of investments that have paid off in how we construct computers that make decisions for us or with us, depending on how they're configured. And then the other part I'll just say, and this kind of goes directly to the question of accountability, is the appetite for experimentation, right? And so when we're talking about, I agree completely that there's no decision that I think a government makes today that doesn't have some aspect of computation as part of it, but the appetite for experimenting among government officials I know, and everyone from the top policymakers to the kind of career staff and bureaucracy people, they seem much more excited and willing, not all of them, but just as a group, to kind of try this out, right? To see what might happen if we implement some of these things, which has really serious consequences for a lot of different communities. And so the question I wanted to sort of throw out is, if we have these sort of technology changes happening on some capacities, and there are others as well, are there unique opportunities or challenges for lawmakers or policymakers here that those people should be thinking about right now? Or is this in some ways just the same set of challenges that they should always be thinking about with every sort of technological advance we make? I mean, is there something special here that we should be trying to highlight or pay attention to for policymakers or for lawyers or for judges or anyone that you would urge them to consider that's different than any other challenge that they faced around the technological aspects of government? That's open to anyone.
I'm really struggling because I think it's not a new challenge in that we would hope that legislators or government officials are thinking about principles like due process at all stages of considering something, but I think we are dealing with something new because of some of the constraints that I mentioned as to why I'm interested in the work that I do, in that I think we're now living in a time where a lot of officials feel like they can't really make informed decisions. It's kind of they need to react. And it doesn't, and there's not as much time or resources to allow for a more nuanced discussion or discourse about what is the best alternative. Which is this is kind of like not an answer to the answer, but I don't think it's a new challenge that we're dealing with. I just think it's dealing or forcing people to still grapple with the same questions they should be grappling with despite constraints.
But maybe the time,
Yeah.
are you suggesting that maybe the time frames that they're having to grapple with them might be different?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, interesting, yeah.
I think I agree with Rashida, but I'd add this maybe added thought. It's maybe 40% the same kinds of questions that we've been facing, and then 60%, to my mind, or a little over 50%, something a little bit new. And this is the way I would put it. It's very familiar to all lawyers and law students to have problems that, you know, an economist would describe as an agency problem, where there are two parties and their interests might diverge, but they have to contract in some way. And you could think about a good chunk of what law does as dealing with agency problems between humans. So between Congress and an agency, or between the electorate and Congress, or between, you know, leader of an organization and a subordinate employee of some kind. And it's fair to say that we've had hundreds of years at least of experience, if not more, in how to adapt law to deal with different versions of that agency problem. The agency problem here might be between a human and a sophisticated convolutional neural net that has a couple of interesting properties. So one is it can do stuff that we previously thought was very difficult for technology to do. Like it can be at the core of a system that helps a vehicle work autonomously. So now we can do new things, and we have to specify what priority the car will give to saving pedestrians versus saving the passenger of the car. But more crucially, the kind of magic that that network can provide is partly based on the fact that it spots patterns in ways that even its creator cannot necessarily describe perfectly. So the creator can tell you mathematically what's going on, but that can't tell you exactly why these data have produced this particular response. Now I think that's potentially a little different, but now let me layer one third thing on top of that. Imagine that people agree that there should be some process through which that neural network is sort of forced to provide some reason giving that the rest of us can understand, so we can decide whether we like the way the car prioritized, whether to hit the pedestrian or to save the passenger. What assures that that explanation actually fits the analytics of what the neural network did? I think that's a really interesting question. There are going to be times when that's easy, times when that's hard, but that's a new kind of agency problem, particularly given that the very same techniques, like the pattern recognition, could be used to optimize the kind of reason giving to persuade the listener, but not necessarily to give a completely accurate answer.
Can I
That
just
makes
add one
sense?
thing?
Yeah.
I also think one of the challenges that we're dealing with is people are less comfortable questioning technology in a way that I think it's almost like you're an outsider if you, or people think you're a Luddite if you just question why is this output happening. And I think it's because of the prevalence of technology that we're all familiar with it. So there's this assumption of, oh, Facebook was great, therefore all of these other tools will be great, and it's only value added. And I think people aren't as comfortable being more suspect or even questioning whether tech is really even value added, or whether we should be asking greater questions about its outputs.
Yeah. And I'll just throw one more thing on top of that I think is a salient difference, which is that at least in a lot of places where government entities or even private entities make decisions about us, we have this expectation, in the government context we call it due process, or maybe we call it fairness or something else. In private contexts, that decisions are really being made about you as an individual, right? If you are getting sent to jail pre-trial, or if you are getting a loan, or if you are getting a job, or if you are being allowed to board a flight, right? That whatever the decision is made has to do with actually you, the human being, you know, Rachel Goodman standing in front of you, and the sum total of me. And that is not what these systems, generally speaking, are doing, right? They're creating averages and probabilities and saying, you know, we can deduce from lots of people who look mostly like you in the ways we have decided are salient in the design of the system that someone who, you know, this figure who approximates you as translated through this data ought or ought not be allowed to board the plane or continue receiving your Medicaid benefits or, you know, be allowed to be free pending your trial. And that is a really profound shift, right? I think when, just to take the pretrial risk thing as an example, because people talk about it a lot, it's totally true that judges bring biases to the table when they decide whether, you know, I, a white woman of my age and educational background and profession and all of that, ought to be detained pretrial, and that those are likely different biases that they bring to the table when someone who looks very different from me is in front of the judge. But those biases, for what maybe they are, you know, people argue that it's a statistic, you know, that's a statistical decision somewhere in your brain too. I think it is profoundly different to interact with your government in a way that where you actually get to say, it's me. Like, let me make arguments that are specific to me, than it is to have that be a statistical approximation. And I think that's one of the really big shifts that we don't really know how to grapple with.
You know, I want to connect that to the more of a fundamental question around what does accountability look like, right? So you mentioned due process, and we mentioned a number of situations where I think people would assume that your constitutional rights around due process apply, like do you go to jail or get released, certain fundamental rights to housing or public benefits, school, education, these kind of things, job discrimination, you know, looking at the laws we have around fair housing and equal protection, right? But one of the things that's challenging here, right, is, and I think it goes to this question of a reason, right? When we have due process in the court system, one of the things that is required is that when a decision, an adjudication is made, that it's not just the answer, it's the answer and why to some degree, right? Maybe not as much as we want, maybe it's not in the form we want, but some sort of explanation. And then on some level, you know, maybe that decision gets appealed, right? So maybe at some point a Supreme Court gets to review it. And that there's a sense that there'll be a kind of correction that can happen if things have gone off the rails and a very bad result occurs. And so when we start to look at these sort of questions around computation adjudication, right? I think it raises other questions because the humans in the system of government, the humans in the system of the courts, other places, we do, I think, have some sense that they can be held accountable. Maybe politically, maybe in the press, maybe actually legally. You know, we sort of think on some level we have a handle on what humans care about, and we can try to think about different deterrence mechanisms or compensation or even punishment in some contexts, right? But I think what some people struggle with when they think about as more and more of these kind of decisions or adjudications or determinations get made, that, you know, machines aren't going to care about any of the things that the humans care about, at least not yet, right? And probably not for a very, very long time. We're not talking about like robots and superhuman intelligence and all that stuff. So does that change the way we think about accountability? Or does it mean that we just simply have to tie all these decisions back to some human at some point, right? Is the sort of human in the loop response the right response? Or how do we kind of think about this in terms of, because it may be such that the humans have no idea why, as you suggest, that these things are happening, right? And so I just want to think about like our systems of accountability for the decision making. Do those shift at all?
Well, so let me pick up on that. It is absolutely crucial to accept that often when humans give an account of what motivates them individually, they may not be actually describing what in fact drives their behavior. We have tons of social psychology research to try to bear that out. But the relevant comparison is not necessarily between an individual human decision maker and a particular kind of algorithm. It's between different kinds of human-machine systems and different kinds of reason-giving requirements. So think about the way adjudication plays out in our court system. We don't have a trial court judge have the final word on something, although sometimes they should because they're very smart. We have different layers of review, and it's the forced reason-giving and ability to challenge those reasons that I think begins to sound in the key of what we mean when we say accountability. I'll also add a reference to the jury. Like, it is not infrequent to have a conversation with people not from the American legal system that say, how insane is it to have some really technical, complicated tort case or intellectual property case decided by jury? how is that like efficient, fair, sensible? And there are some good questions about that, perhaps, but there are also some potentially compelling answers to that. And the answers tend not to be, well, juries are smarter than judges, or jurors always know what the right reasons are to explain their behavior. It's something about constraining concentrated power with members of the community that are sort of forced to pass judgment on certain aspects of the argument and give it a certain kind of legitimacy. So, I mean, that just begs further questions, but I do think we should be comfortable disaggregating that word accountability and being more specific about it. Can I add one more thing, though?
please go.
I mean, why is this conversation interesting? Well, to me, the main reason why it's interesting is because all these technologies we're talking about, convolutional neural networks, expert systems spiked with the ability to do like rapid search and whatnot, autonomous vehicles, they have real upsides. I think it would be, or let me put it this way, I think it is hard to make an argument that they don't sometimes have real upsides. And I'll highlight two domains that should be interesting to this audience: access to justice and access to healthcare. These are both domains where it's not like there's so much ability to meet demand that like nobody comes up short in having access to those domains. The problem is that, you know, along with some of those benefits will come awkward questions about how we know what we're doing and what systemic effects might arise that we didn't plan but we have to live with.
So that's actually a perfect segue to my last sort of question between us, and then I will want to turn to the audience. So if you all have questions, start to think about them. We'll have people with microphones that can come to you. So just wait for the microphone because we are recording this. And my last question sort of to think about as a group up here is, so there's this task force that Mayor de Blasio is going to appoint. And like, where should they start? Like, you know, if he were to come to you, or say you were appointed the chair of the task force, or any of these kind of opportunities came up to have like direct actionable input, where do you start with these questions? And kind of what is our path that we think we have for approaching these sort of ideas and accountability frameworks? Or is there some other way to go? Like where would we start off on this New York City adventure?
Well, I think the first step is figuring out where in government systems are being used, because that's part of the problem, is we're citing examples that we know about from media because of FOIA litigation or investigative journalism.
What's FOIA?
Freedom of Information Law, or FOIA, which is the federal version. And so we only really have a limited understanding of how pervasive these systems are used. So I think the first step is figuring out where they're used, and then that's when you start to grapple with, I think, larger questions about, are there areas of government use that should just be completely off hands? We're not comfortable with, we only want a human decision, or we want some type of hybrid. We don't want what's in use right now. Is there a middle ground in sort of drawing the lines around use that we're comfortable with? And then I think there's tons of other questions you can go from there, but I think the first question is understanding where use is happening and what we're comfortable with and what we're not comfortable with.
Yeah, and I'll just, I think one of the things that's tricky about sort of how these systems are used in government that I think we keep coming up against in this conversation about the New York City process is, it feels to me like there are two really different sets of things we're talking about, right? One is kind of intra-governmental decisions. So where resources go, how agencies run themselves, and how computerized systems fit into that. And that's really important, obviously, because I think everyone in this room thinks the way government functions is important to people's lives. But it's something different, I think, than when government is making externally facing decisions about individuals' lives or about, schools or communities or institutions that are profoundly community institutions. And I think, the sort of highfalutin version of the task is we want to make sure that democratic processes continue to work, or maybe even work better than they work now, when we're using these systems, right? We definitely have problems at all levels of our government now with transparency and accountability and fairness, and the opportunity, for what it means to have to design a system that says you have to hit the pedestrian every time, or you always have to hit the smaller number of people, or whatever that rule is we don't get to say that with judges, and I mean, we do, we have a constitution. Judges shouldn't put people in jail based on the color of their skin, but they do, right? So the opportunity at some level is to say, if we are going to have to spell out every rule and norm for the way these decision systems work, then that's a moment where we might be able to design decision-making that is more fair and more transparent and more accountable than we've been able to do in democracy so far. But that is like a huge task of translation, because the people, generally speaking, the people designing the systems, making the decisions, are totally separate, right? They're often private vendors, not even like pretending to function in the democratic system, and then just importing these technologies that we then have to sort of say something about norms on top of, right? So if we were able to design and create and sort of soup to nuts a process where people who are going to be impacted by these systems got to say, let's talk about what the rules should be. Here's what the right set of rules would be. Here are the rules that would give everyone a voice. We can vote on the rules. I think there's some process like that we have. I don't know. Or we can throw the bums out if they vote on the wrong set of rules. And then let's make a system that meets that set of norms and that we can all see and continue to talk about. That even acknowledging that there might still be some areas of the world in which we don't want that system anyway for some other value set of reasons. But I think, that the sort of bringing democratic norms into these processes is the goal.
And one more thing to add that's connected to New York City, because I realize we keep talking about government as this amorphous thing when it's really layers, is what's within the authority of this task force to actually change. So there's certain things that are going to be dictated from the top down. So if the CDC says that every local health department has to use a certain system to test for HIV, then it's not really up to the New York City Department of Health to make a determination about whether that's the right system to use. So I think I'm just flagging that as something to keep in mind, is that it's not always something that can be resolved on one level of government, but these are also questions that we have to grapple with on multiple layers of, is this something within local authority? If not, then what does the state have authority to do? And then if not, go to the federal government. And it also gives us as people and advocates an idea of where we should be targeting our advocacy.
That sounds good to me.
Yeah, one thing I'll add, and then I'll open it up, and we can start with questions from all you. The sort of vendor relationship is something, I mean, it's a little wonky in the weeds for a lot of people sometimes, but like so many governments depend on private companies to supply all kinds of things to them, including technologies, right? And so this vendor relationship, though, I do think is a critical piece. But also, and I'll say that this is one of the things that the AI Now Institute that I work with emphasizes. I also think there's an entire research community that does care about these questions. And having the ability for experts that are external to government to do reviews, to do audits, or even just to kind of engage with the people who are acting in good faith inside government who want to take advantage of the technologies, right? They want the system to be better, to be more just, to be more fair, to provide more access. All those things are great. And we just, I think, so part of what I hope the task force at least will do will strengthen the conversation between an external set of conversations that are happening in affected communities, the people who are at the effect of the decisions, the researchers who are, who spent their careers trying to understand and improve these systems, and then the people who are in government trying to figure out what the right answers are. And I think that we have an opportunity. I'm optimistic, hopefully, that we'll have an opportunity to bring those conversations closer together here. Because otherwise, yeah, I think otherwise, if they fly apart, then we're taking a step back, not a step forward. So I want to turn and involve all of you more in this. Thank you for being part of the listening part. Here's part of the discussion part. Who has the microphones? Can you raise your hand so we see? Okay, there's some microphones back there. Okay, so if you have a question, now you raise your hand, and someone with a microphone will come to you and hold your question until you have the microphone. All right, yeah, we'll start there. Go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks. Thanks so much to all of the panelists. So a lot of the conversation has been about sort of ex post considerations like fairness of outcomes and accountability. But But another important theme in the law, I think, is fair notice, that private individuals organize their affairs around notice of what the rule is. So certainly in the administrative law context, notice and comment encapsulates this idea that public participation is important not only for democratic norms but also to help governments make appropriate decisions. So this seems really complicated in the AI context because often what's being codified is the meta rule and not really the decisional rule. So how do you, I guess the question to the panel is, how does that complication bear out in terms of giving private individuals fair notice about how to organize their lives?
Yes. I think you're right to highlight that as a real problem. So I do think part of the answer is that this is a problem that we deal with in law a lot, and we've dealt with a lot. But I think you're also right that there's something potentially a little new depending on just how much we rely on, especially the current generation of fancy AI, the deep learning technology, because you can imagine something that sounds like a really clear rule, but is nothing more than an incredibly vague standard. It's like, we will follow these 5 procedures, but step 4, the one that really makes a difference, is we feed all the data into this particular system, and then it's going to just spit out a score. And if the score is above 95%, we're going to regulate, right? And let's be fair with respect to judges and lawyers and the difficulty they honestly face whenever they deal with a complex scientific issue, right? So even leaving aside the AI stuff, whenever a judge and her law clerks are trying to make sense of the administrative record to decide if an agency, say, appropriately regulated this molecule, even if they're lucky enough to have a law clerk that has a chemistry degree, they're really hurting at some level. Like they are frequently pulled into the familiar forms of what lawyers are most expert in, which is process, right? Well, were these particular rules followed? Was the expert that designed the system the right kind of expert? Does that expert say that this works? Yes, check, check, check. And ultimately, I worry that in the end, if we do that too much, we will be evading the real burden of your question, which is, if we expect there is some degree of dialogue back and forth, like through notice and comment, with the affected public, we ought to have enough clarity about what it is that is actually driving the decision. And at the same time, ideally, we ought not to deprive ourselves completely of the benefit of some of these new techniques that help us spot things that even really thoughtful humans in conversation with each other are not able to spot. So I think in a way, what we ought to aim for is the proper level of trust and distrust. To go back to something Rashida said earlier, how many of you have heard of the Stanley Milgram experiment involving the white lab coat and shocking subjects? Does that ring a bell? So most of you have. Just to recap the basics, like, you can manipulate even very thoughtful subjects who seem to have a lot of integrity into shocking an innocent person who says that he has a heart condition and he might be at risk because of the shock. A crucial aspect of the finding is that if you just have someone give the instructions as a white lab coat on, even if you don't tell the subject anything about whether that person has an NYU degree or not, the subject will respond much more and will comply much more. And so that sort of the risk of over-relying on something that seems too scientific and technically precise is very real, I think.
Okay, I just want to throw one more question on top of that question, which is the vendor relationship thing makes that a lot more complicated too, right? Because there's you hear these arguments all the time. We can't tell people how these decisions get made, because then they will govern their lives according to making themselves look like a winner for the system, right? Which is the most insane anti-democratic possible statement you could make, right? But by the way, that's the way these things exist, right? In the private realm, you all have credit scores and all kinds of other tenant scores and health scores and insurance scores, where that has already happened, where all these data points about the way you move in the world that you don't know are going into this special sauce or going into the special sauce and will affect decisions that are made about you. And it's very lucrative, but it's nuts.
Yeah. One thing I'll also add really quickly is the time frame around notice is also a little challenging and something that we're thinking about, right? So, in law, when there's a lawsuit or criminal prosecution against you, there are various moments in which, if you're a person of interest or a suspect, or you get arrested or things, that you at least have some notice, oh shit, I'm in trouble, I gotta deal with this, right? Or you get served with papers, things like that. In other proceedings, right, this notice and comment for a regulatory process, you may not know if you individually will be affected by this regulation or this benefit, but like in theory, there's a public notice that you would have a chance to respond to, right? When I was talking about the sensor networks, right, a lot of this information gets collected about you before you have any notice of even, no one who collects information may even know what it'll be used for in the future, right? So there's this like kind of time dilation kind of problem too around notice. None of us, the sort of privacy policy fatigue, we don't read them, et cetera, it just gets worse and worse and worse when some of this information may well be collected and then eventually utilized, and then how you disentangle that also, I think, is a notice problem of a certain sort around due process and fairness. Where are we with the microphones?
Hi. This is a really exciting topic, partly because I don't know a lot about it. But one of the things that, for somebody who doesn't know a lot about it, seems at least a potential outcome of this kind of review that we're seeing in New York, is that by talking seriously about how algorithms are making decisions that impact people, it casts a light on how non-algorithmic actors are making decisions and forces us to think very seriously about, well, if the algorithm we don't like produces exactly the same or slightly better outcome than the black box that is a human making the decision, well, maybe we don't like the algorithm, but what really is the process that's going into the human decision? Speaking in a very narrow way about this task force, do you think, is it optimistic to think that that attention to decision-making processes is a real outcome? Might we see organizations clarify or make explicit some of the factors that they're using? And is this analysis reasonable at all, or is it really kind of two separate issues of technology and decision-making? Thank you.
Well, I'll just start the ball rolling, although I'll acknowledge that the two people on each of my sides are the experts on what's happening in New York. I think that they are not the different issues at all. I think that we are ultimately talking about how in the early 21st century and going forward do we want law to affect the way we make decisions and force us to understand those decisions, or at least help us understand those decisions. And I would say that two things, perhaps, about the way you frame the question are really helpful in understanding the limits of what can be done by a task force like this one. One is that we have to acknowledge that, after decades of research on behavioral economics and social psychology, we still have this problem that one person's bias in decision-making is another person's legitimate democratic preference, right? So if you think about the reaction that somebody might have living within a couple of miles of a nuclear power plant, we have thoughtful scientists who might say they're heavily overweighing the risk of nuclear catastrophe if they don't want to live there relative to the risk they take every day when they get in their car. But somebody else might say, somebody with a more philosophical bent, well, wait a second. It's legitimate for somebody to say, the fear that I'm having is not really just the fear of living 3 miles away from the nuclear power plant. It's a more generalized sense that I don't understand the levels of safety and the accountability, and maybe we ought not to ignore that. So this is similar to the debates that happen over GMOs and food and whatnot. And I don't think that is always an easy debate to resolve. I think there are times when one has to say, no, it may seem like a really legitimate position to take, but actually this is pretty safe and you're wrong, right? And there are other times when a very technocratic frame might suggest that this is just a quirk of human decision-making that we'd all be better off squeezing out of the decision, but we ought to think carefully about whether it isn't sensible for a community to say, we have a preference for the community to deal with architecture and historical preservation this way, even if it doesn't fit into somebody's optimization formula that seems to prioritize other things. And then the second point I would make is closely related. When we hear the arguments for relying on algorithms, they often seem to assert two things. The promoters of these arguments will sometimes assert two arguments that are at somewhat in tension with each other. So one argument is, with the technology we have right now that is based on pattern recognition and not just on the use of symbolic logic, we can actually capture the quirks of human decision-making in a meaningful way, right? Because we take lots of different kinds of data and we don't make as many assumptions about it. But also this technology can help us overcome human bias. So everybody in this audience should recognize how those two things, it's really actually hard to reconcile them. So some priority setting is important so that we don't just get garbage in, garbage out.
And I also think the attention to decision-making is really important, because I think the problem that both systems-based decisions and human decisions have is that for too long we were assuming that both could be objective, and the truth is they're both subjective. And I think when thinking about the accountability question, knowing that there's bias everywhere, there's going to be bias or even just error built into systems, and humans, there's no way to correct the assumptions we make because of how we live in this world. So I think it's working with the assumption that all of these decisions are subjective and informed by some level of bias. Can we correct for that? Is that the right way to ensure accountability, to make certain assumptions about failures and then correct? And that, I don't know the answer to that, but that is one thing that we're grappling with. And I think one example of that comes up around school choice, and that Jason mentioned the high school choice algorithm that's used here in New York City, which is just a matching program, but it's flawed because you're dealing with 500 options and you only get to choose 12. But one model that's being used within districts that are trying to address segregation issues is a control choice. So if diversity in a school is a goal, can you account for that by weighing factors differently to achieve both the district goal and optimizing parental decisions? And there's lots of debates about that, and I'm not going to get into it, but that's just one example of a way to try to, where you're working on the assumption that it's not objective or it's not perfect. So how do you adjust?
Yeah, and I'll just add to this too, that I think one of the opportunities that we have right now is not only just to understand how the decisions are made, but to try to have more of a conversation of how do we measure outcomes, and who's impacted and who's affected, and who's winning and who's losing. And so it feeds into the kind of nuclear power plant choice. Like each person might have a different set of values, but also we can look at aggregate group impacts, right? Is there disparate impact on certain groups and others that we may not have recognized before, but now these systems, not only do we enumerate the systems and decision-making processes, but we actually get hopefully more access to study them and study the impact of these decision-making processes. And hopefully if everyone's acting in good faith and we learn that we could do it better, we do it better, whether it be from human or machine. So I think there's a real fighting the automation bias problem, which is kind of how, this idea that the machines are, better than us at making decisions or whatever, more objective, and saying, no, it's a human-computer interface problem in a sense that we need to study and examine as a system. And then if we can improve the system overall, especially for the least advantaged people, the people with the least power in the process, then we can call that a step forward. But I think we need to figure out what is a step forward in the process. That's a critical piece of this, or we just won't know what we're doing. Other questions? Yeah, you're right here, and then over there.
Thank you very much for the panel. It's a very good topic. I just want to ask a question with the new deep learning technology and how it is assembled. I'm just imagining that like it can go rogue, or like it's like something that you build and you don't know, like a child that you don't know how he's going to react. So many companies are now building already deep learning technologies and are already doing that. So you never know when a mistake can happen and something can go wrong. So why does the Congress or like the legislature in most developed countries don't react to this, like by monitoring how these like processes are going? And if they do, how will they be able to do that? Because it's like sort of an unknown. You know that it can have some benefits, but you don't really understand how risky it can be. It can wipe the whole world, or it cannot be that risky. You never know. So I'm really like fascinated by this deep learning thing.
So just a quick thought about that. I don't think that the technology as it exists right now poses that kind of existential risk, but you know, there are risks that are quite substantial nonetheless that we should bear in mind. I think the more immediate risk is that if you're relying on a technology that at core is a very fancy way of fitting curves onto data to understand how to predict what will happen, but it can evolve on its own and perhaps begin to do this in ways that were not anticipated before. That's part of what makes it useful. Then the question arises how you know it's performing optimally. And there are going to be some situations where perhaps the best way to do that is to compare the outcomes of the algorithm to the behavior of a very competent person that you think is really good at his or her job. So let's say, for example, you have an algorithm that helps grade law school exams, and it seems to provide feedback and of the kind that students are happy with. They can't even really tell the difference between what's written by the professor and the algorithm. But if we wanted to know if that was really working very well, we might prohibit some professors from using that technology and compare the results over time. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but that's a small piece of the puzzle. And I guess, to me, that suggests that all kinds of examples like that require a lot of self-consciousness on the part of organizations to deliberately segregate some people from using technologies so that they can compare what the outcomes are. Otherwise, it becomes difficult to know how reliance on the technology becomes its own factor, shaping how an entire organization works. So you're a hospital that begins to rely on techniques that save time, but that after 5 or 8 years begin to erode the skills that certain doctors have to do certain things that they might have to do in an emergency, for example.
Well, and one of the things, so this question of what is fairness comes up a lot, related to due process, but also, so there's an entire field, fairness, accountability, transparency, machine learning. Just to plug, NYU, we're having a big conference here, right in this room actually, Friday and Saturday, for the computer scientists and the related disciplines that are looking at this. But one of the things about fairness is it is a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary problem, right? It's not a technical thing that only technologists can like think about, like how do we judge this system, whether it be deep learning or any other kind of neural net or any other kind of system, right? That you really need the collective wisdom of people who have been studying, like, what does fairness look like? What does equality look like? How does social progress get made? Because those are long-standing, 100-year-old and more disciplines that have actually come up with metrics and empirical, like, scientific tools and things to understand our impact on people's lives. And so I just want to say, like, those, we shouldn't discard those resources when we look at these questions of the impact of new technologies, because many of those disciplines have invested heavily in robust tools that can guide us in understanding maybe not how everything works, but on what impact it's having on people's lives. And I think that's a nice grounding set of questions whenever you're dealing with something that maybe isn't as clear in terms of how it's processing information. Right there, do you have a microphone? I don't know.
Thank you for the discussion. It's given me much more coherent mental models for thinking about these problems. We've discussed being able to audit the decisions and how decisions were made by these systems. We've also discussed sort of white or blacklisting the types of decisions or the realms in which we're okay or not okay with using these systems to make these decisions. What I wonder is where, if at all, is the role for openness of, say, the source code for these systems or the training data sets. And I guess the other side of this is not just the openness of these systems, but also the accountability of the people who are building them on the individual and organizational level. Those both seem like serious challenges that I don't know that we're grappling with very well, and I wonder if there's precedent or what you think about that.
Rashida, would you mind talking a little bit about sort of the broader surveillance and technology context and like the analogy? I just feel like there's so much that's analogized to other work we've done.
Yeah, so that's actually how I became interested in these issues is looking, so you're talking more about the tension between transparency and accountability. Can you have both? And that is a real question to grapple with, because I think we do have systems. I'll go back, I'm gonna just keep using the school choice model because
Go for
it's
it.
one, but I think it's the perfect model of, we know the factors and variables that are used, yet the system is still producing highly racially and socioeconomically segregated schools and a lot of other, it's like it hasn't been value added. So what happens when you do know what's going on in the system, somehow the system's being gained, but there's no accountability to address the problems that you see in the outputs? And sorry, I know I'm not going into the surveillance piece, but I just wanted to get that in. But and in the surveillance realm, I think, oh, well, now I'm gonna pause for a second.
I'll say the
Yeah.
thought I was sort of having, and but just that, you know, I think we need both of those things, right? And I think the number of people for whom access to the source code is really going to be the transformative thing with respect to accountability is a very small number of people, and those are not the only people whose evaluation of the systems matter. And I know you're not saying that, right? So I think that's a component, and I think it's certainly something to push for, and I think we should be really skeptical of motivations for not being transparent about that source code. Again, to sort of go back to the vendor problem, right? I don't think that the motivations that I am aware of for not being transparent about it are not persuasive to me. But I think that and that's the way in which maybe this is different, to take us back to the beginning. But I think there are some ways in which it is profoundly the same as other situations in which government is using technologies in ways that affect people's lives, and that's sort of the bone I was trying to throw.
Yeah. But also I think that I kind of had my pieces I wanted to say, so I'm like not answering them. But I also think, and this came up in a lot of our surveillance work, that there's an inherent issue with this private-public model that you have with vendors, in that vendors need to monetize something. They're not just, or maybe there is some vendor that's doing it for the goodwill and no money, but I haven't seen one. And so you have a problem there in that's where you run into proprietary issues, and you may have a vendor that is trying to do something in good faith, but they still need to monetize something to subsist. So they can't just hand over all information and be completely transparent, even if they are trying to work towards something good. And you have governments that don't necessarily have the institutional resources or even knowledge to do it in-house, so we're forced to deal with this model where we're depending on outside sources to develop things to address government concerns, and there's sort of a tension in the interest there that creates this problem of, can you have both transparency and accountability, and if so, how do you balance those in the right way? And I don't really think we've found a way to do it in society. I think providing some level of transparency is important, but you also have the challenge of, okay, great, if I know that I'm being monitored by cameras when I walk down West 4th Street, but I still need to come to school, then like, is that a real alternative? And what happens when we're not really giving people alternatives or to choose from?
Yeah, I agree. I do think there are methods we have, however imperfect, to help us strike the balance that sometimes will come in handy, like in-camera review. But I do think there's a tension. There are situations, for example, when scarce resources might affect the ability of a public health agency, for example, to inspect all the facilities it wants to inspect in terms of food safety. And in order to optimize those resources, you might have to weigh like what factors suggest that there's greater risk in some sites, and if you disclose everything, yes, it can be gamed a little. So I don't think those rationales are completely like irrelevant, but by the same token, particularly as the importance of the decision that is partially entrusted to a human-machine system becomes greater and greater, then you want to have some means of understanding what's actually driving that. Otherwise, it's just hard to have an intelligent conversation about it.
Yeah, I was going to just add to that on these points that There's sort of two risks I see with technological transparency. It's not, again, like it's not helpful, but it privileges certain kinds of interested parties over others, right? And so without trying to use stereotype, I mean, there could be many members of affected communities that have the technical or sophisticated knowledge to understand source code, or would have proxies, people who they could look to, who would then help them understand those things. That might all be possible, but I would start with, well, these communities are gonna be impacted the most. What do they wanna know? And how do they want to know it? And in what form is it accessible and gives them agencies in the process of determining their own fate, or however we want to characterize it, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is that there's just a lot of data and information that for many reasons, including political and sociological, is not collected or made available at all. So for instance, in the predictive policing context, right, there have been a lot of people concerned about predictive policing systems that try to guess where crime's going to happen based on historical crime data and police reports which have racial bias or other biases in them, right? And so certain over-policed neighborhoods, shock, surprise, end up being the hotspots the computer recommends that the cops hang out in, right? Which means more arrests, which means more police, right? So there are these concerns. There are lots of data points that are not collected, such as the history of which cops have been arrested or charged with corruption, or community complaints about certain officers or certain policing practices. Those may not be collected as data, so we can't make them transparent, right? If we believe that there are other biases or unfairness kind of metrics in the system, if they're not collected and given the same authority as the other data we have, then we don't actually have complete transparency. And so I just worry about overweighting transparency when we don't have a full insight into the systemic ways in which these things work, as an open question that we need to continue to try to answer. All right, so one last question, and then we'll end and you can hang around a little bit for a few. Maybe we'll take a walk outside, who knows. Over there, yeah, right in the cap.
So from a technological perspective, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what transparency actually means. So for example, like you could have access to the source code, but if there are non-deterministic parts of that source code where there's, you're sampling from a distribution and there's an element of randomness there, you could have the source code and the data and come up with completely different results based on different execution runs. So I've heard a counter to that, well, okay, if you could store a history, for example, of every single evaluation of an algorithm or every single training run, so you can have a history of inputs and outputs. But then you need data versioning as well, because a certain subset of the data is going to be run for a particular training run and things like that. And then you get back to a technological problem, which is you can't store everything forever. So even to use your example about cops and video images, I think in some cases, some departments keep the data on hand for 30 days, because that's at most that you can do, because it's impossible and for technological reasons, and also prohibitively expensive to store all that data forever. So is it even really possible, I guess, to have transparency, even if you have all of the tech available for anyone to scrutinize, if you can never really replicate what an algorithm did, again, later on in terms of making things reproducible?
All right, easy question.
Oh. That's a terrific question. Thank you. It's very complicated, and I think that if we're going to be intellectually honest, I think we should recognize that even, the premise of your question is persuasive to me, which is to say, the nature of the technology we were now deploying is such that even if you have the source code, that doesn't mean you can actually reproduce the chain of logic, if you want to call it that led to this particular outcome. So that said, I think two observations I would make that might help the discussion would be the following, might help. The first one is that there's a tension between privacy protection and accountability for decisions. So let's say in that subset of algorithms that could be logically constructed, that where more disclosure would actually provide more transparency, and it is a subset, if we get rid of the data in 30 days, for example, to protect privacy, we'll have less of an ability to reconstruct what happened. And I think we should be honest about that tension as well. And then second, I would say, there's a real frontier to me for terrific research. And I'm happy to be connected to AI Now as well, and hope that AI Now and sister institutions and scholars will do this kind of research to sort of create new frameworks that involve law and computer science and psychology and math, probably, that would do things like the following, that would say, okay, we can't reconstruct exactly what happened here, but we can actually create some tweaked algorithms that can give you some comparative statics around how little variations and perturbations produce potentially big different outcomes. And so one way the conversation go forward is then say, we may not be able to know everything, but we know how these 3 or 4 different architectures create somewhat different decisions, and now let's argue about what makes them different.
The other approach, of course, would just be to say, we shouldn't be using systems like that to make these kinds of decisions, because nobody can ever understand them, much, given the complexity of academic attempts to understand them, right? Actual human beings without advanced degrees can't find their place in those systems, and that is not how we should make decisions.
Yeah, I actually was going to say the same thing in
Sorry.
that I think it does force us to question whether even using the systems is worth it. And I'm not going to name what agency, but I remember being in a meeting with a government agency where they had to create a full list of all the different data points they were collecting, and then realized they didn't even have good justifications for collecting some of that data. So then they were like, actually, we don't need to collect these 10 points on people. And so I think even if there is no way to be fully transparent, I think the practice of some level of review could result in just questioning whether we should be using a system in the first place or whether there's a better alternative.
And I'll just add, in the spirit of being empathetic and supportive of people who are trying to do the right thing inside government, that we've been starving governments and public agencies of funding for all this kind of stuff for so long. It's like, how do we expect more when we offer less money and less resources and less expertise to do this, right? And so I think that conversation, the conversation about how we fund the kind of governments that we want and how we want them to be responsible and accountable is connected. And I don't mean funding like to hire another vendor. I mean like actually providing them with the support in-house to have the expertise and to do the work they need to do to assure us that they're being responsible in the kind of mandate they have. So I'll just sort of say that as a hopefully optimistic move that we could make. So with that, I wanted to thank everyone on the panel here, so please join me. And all of you for being part of this conversation. And I hope it will continue. Thank you.